Not tonight, old man. It's Christmas. 40 years ago, I built this house.
No one passes a dark house. Not tonight.
Supper's near ready. You'll want to shed those boots.
On Christmas Eve, in the year 1887, in a small town in Montana Territory, 12 doors closed on a dying beggar. One door opened. By spring, the woman who opened it, the poorest widow in the valley, held in her hands the deed to every drop of water for 40 miles. And the fate of the rich man who had shut his door first. This is the story of what one candle in a window bought. Not tonight, old man. It's Christmas. The oak door of the finest house in Hollow Creek was already swinging shut as the words were spoken, the way a man swats at a fly without breaking his stride. For a moment, through the narrowing gap, the old man on the porch could see inside. A chandelier burning with real candles, a fir tree taller than a wagon, dressed in ribbon and silver. He could hear a piano and laughter and the particular ring of crystal touching crystal, a sound he had not heard in 40 years. Then the door closed, and the latch fell, and the music became something that belonged to other people. The old man stood in the cold a while longer than made any sense. Snow gathered on the shoulders of a coat that had been another man's coat 20 years ago. He did not curse, and he did not knock again. He only stepped back into the yard and looked up at the great house, at the steep gables, at the porch rails, at the small carved star set into the wood above the door frame, half hidden under paint. And here is the strange thing. The strangers who passed him on the road that night would tell you he looked at that house the way no beggar looks at a rich man's house. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he built with his own hands. His name, the only part of it he still used, was Josiah. And if you had asked him what he was doing in Hollow Creek, Montana Territory on the 24th of December in the year of our Lord 1887, he would not have told you the truth. He would have said he was passing through. Old men with bad lungs and worn-out boots are always passing through. But the truth is that nobody passes through Hollow Creek in the dead of winter. The stage didn't run past November. The passes were shut. The only people in that valley were the people who had nowhere else in the world to be. Josiah had walked in over the Wolf Ridge Trail, which no one walked in December, and he had come down past the frozen springs, and he had stood a long time at the head of the valley, looking at the little town below, with its smoking chimneys before he came down among its people. He had come, though he told no one, to die at home. You have to understand what kind of winter it was, to understand what the town did next, though understanding is not the same as excusing. And this story means to do neither. The winter before had been the one the cattlemen still would not speak of, the one they later called the Great Die-Up. Snow to the fence tops in November, a false thaw in January that turned the whole range to a plate of iron. And then the cold came down from Canada like a judgment, 40 below, and the wind screaming for 3 weeks without rest. When spring finally came, the coulees were full of dead cattle. Some ranches lost 6 head in every 10. Fortunes that had taken 20 years to build were gone in 90 days. And the men who owed money on those cattle owed it still. Hollow Creek had survived, the way a man survives losing his fingers to frostbite. The town lived, but something in it had gone hard. Every family on that street had debt at Crane's Bank, and thin flour barrels, and a memory of what the wind could do. Fear had moved into the valley that winter, and fear is a tenant that does not readily give up a room. So when a stranger in rags came down Main Street on Christmas Eve, knocking on doors, the people of Hollow Creek did not see a man. They saw one more mouth, one more hand, one more claim against what little they had left. That is the kindest thing that can be said of them, and it is not very kind. At Pruitt's Mercantile, the lamps were still lit, for Christmas Eve was the last good selling day of the year. Josiah stood just inside the door, dripping, and asked, quietly, the way men ask who are used to the answer, whether there was any work he might do for a warm corner and a heel of bread. Sweeping. Wood. He was good with his hands, he said. Pruitt came around the counter fast, wiping his palms on his apron as if the request itself had dirtied them. "We had a fellow like you through here in October," Pruitt said. "Cleaned me out of 2 hams and a coat. Go on now. I've a family to feed." He said it loudly for the benefit of the 2 customers by the stove. Respectable men nod along when a shopkeeper guards his shelves, and Pruitt lived on the nods of respectable men. Josiah looked at him a moment, not with anger but with something worse, recognition, as if he were reading a page he had read many times before. Then he touched his hat brim and went back out into the snow. Behind him, he heard the bolt slide home. On Christmas Eve. In a town whose church bell had been bought, though not a soul remembered it now, with an anonymous gift of silver 30 years before. At the hotel, they let him stand by the stove for exactly as long as it took to tell him the rooms were full. The rooms were not full. At the livery, the boy wanted to let him sleep in the hay. You could see the wanting in the boy's face. But the owner had beaten charity out of that boy the way you break a colt. And the boy looked at his boots and said he was sorry, mister. He said it twice. It was at the Silver Dollar Saloon that Josiah got the closest thing to mercy the Main Street had to offer. The barkeep, a heavy man named Otto with a face like a shovel, looked him over, said nothing, and set out a single glass of whiskey. Free. Otto had buried a brother on the range in the die-up winter, and had come out of that spring with a rule. Nobody freezes in front of me while I'm holding a bottle. But a saloon on Christmas Eve is full of men drinking to forget the bank. And a beggar is a mirror no such man once hung in front of him. The card table got loud. Somebody said something about tramps and lice, and somebody else laughed the way men laugh when they're afraid. Otto jerked his chin toward the back door, an apology in the gesture, and Josiah drank the whiskey slowly, set the glass down gentle as an egg, and went out the way he was shown. He was coughing by then, the kind of cough that has a color to it if you know what to listen for. Josiah knew what to listen for. He had heard it once before, long ago, in a woman he had not stayed to nurse. The parsonage was the last respectable door, a neat white house beside the dark church. The Reverend Mr. Ainsley opened it himself, and to his credit, for this story keeps honest accounts. His first motion was backward, to swing the door wide. It was his second motion that damned him. A glance over his shoulder, into the warm room where his supper was cooling. "We, of course, the church keeps a mission barrel," the Reverend said. "Flour and blankets. It's distributed in the spring when the wagons run. If you'll leave your name." "It's December, Reverend." Josiah said, not unkindly, just placing the fact between them, like a coin on a counter. Mrs. Ainsley appeared behind her husband's shoulder with a bowl in her hands, already filled, steam rising off it. And the look that passed between husband and wife lasted 3 seconds and contained an entire marriage. What will the deacons say? His eyes said. It's Christmas Eve, hers said. His won, the way they had won for 11 years, and the bowl stayed in the doorway, and the door closed slower than the others had, which changed nothing at all about its closing. Long after, Mrs. Ainsley would say that bowl of stew was the heaviest thing she ever held. 12 doors. That was the count, if anyone had been counting, though the only one counting was the wind. 12 doors on the richest street for 80 miles. On the one night of the year that street celebrated a family who had been turned away from every door in Bethlehem. The lamplight lay in gold bars across the snow, and the smell of roasting geese and cinnamon drifted from under 12 locked doors. Through the window of the last house, Josiah could see children being lifted to hang paper angels on a tree. He stood in the middle of the street a while, a tall bent figure in the falling snow, more scarecrow than man, and looked back up the length of it at the whole bright, frightened, comfortable town. Then he turned and looked the other way, south, past the end of the street, past the stockyards, down where the road gave up being a road. And there, a long way off in the dark, at the edge of town where the land ran down to the frozen creek, one small light was burning. A single candle, set in a window the size of a Bible. Now this story must leave the old man on the road a while, walking toward that light, one dragging step at a time, and go down ahead of him to the house at the end of it, because you cannot understand what that candle cost until you have stood inside the room it was burning in. The cabin at the creek was one room and a loft. It had been on the poor side of humble even in good years, and this was not a good year. The woman who lived there had been born Martha Reese, had been Martha Hale for 26 years, and had been, for the last 2, that thing a small town pities on Sunday and forgets by Wednesday, a widow with nothing. She was 55 years old. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had worked since she was 8, cracked at the knuckles, needle-scarred at the fingertips, and steadier than a courthouse. That day, Christmas Eve, those hands had delivered the last of the mending she took in for pay. A harness, stitched back together for the Kellerman place, carried 4 miles through the snow, for which she had been paid 30 cents, and a sack of cracked corn, the kind you feed to chickens. Martha Hale had no chickens. She had traded the last of them to the doctor in October, in the sickness season, for a neighbor child who was not even hers. Inside the cabin, this was the inventory of her wealth, and the ledger is exact. Half a sack of flour, a knuckle of salt pork the size of a fist, a jar of chokecherry, preserves she had been saving since summer, for a reason she would not say out loud. 3 candles, 1 milk cow gone dry, 1 bed, 1 Bible with a broken spine, and 1 letter on the mantel that she had read so many times she could see it with her eyes closed. The letter was from the bank of Hollow Creek, signed in a small tight hand, S. Crane. It said, in words that wore politeness the way a wolf wears wool, that the note on the Hale property, taken out by her late husband Thomas in the last hard year, to buy seed and time, was due in full on the 1st of April. It said the bank had extended every courtesy. It said failure to remit would result in foreclosure, and public sale. April the 1st. Her son David would have laughed at that. All Fool's Day, Ma. He had been the kind of boy who could make her laugh. At a hanging, 19 years old, shoulders like his father, gone 11 months now. He had died in the employ of the man who signed that letter, riding for Crane's cattle outfit in the die-up winter, sent out with 3 others in weather no foreman should have sent a dog into, to push what was left of the herd down out of the drifts. The others turned back. David, being the boy who finished what he started, did not. They found him in March, when the snow gave him up, still sitting against a fence post, hat pulled down like a man taking a rest. The bank of Hollow Creek had sent no letter that time. Silas Crane had not come to the funeral. His office had, however, and Martha had learned to say this part with a perfectly flat voice, deducted from David's final wages, the cost of the saddle he was found with, it being company property, damaged by weather. So that was the woman at the end of the road, poorest soul in Hollow Creek, in debt to its richest man, with more cause for a locked door than anyone on the street, that had just turned the beggar away 12 times over. And here is what she was doing while the old man walked. She was sitting close to her fire to save the candle, and she was sewing a quilt pieced from feed sacks and the backs of worn-out shirts, some of them shirts that had belonged to men, now under the churchyard snow. She sewed for the church mission barrel every winter. She had done it in the fat years, and she did it now in the lean ones. And if you had pointed out to her that she was, by any honest arithmetic, a charity case, sewing for charity, she would have looked at you the way school teachers look at boys who are clever in useless directions. In the bottom corner of the quilt, where the pattern ended, she was stitching a small bird in red thread. A sparrow. She stitched one into every quilt she made, every one going back 30 years. Her mother had done it before her, back in Missouri, and had given the reason once, in the voice women use for passing down the few things that are actually valuable. Even a sparrow doesn't fall without God taking notice, girl. But folks fall all the time and nobody sees. So you sew the sparrow on, so whoever sleeps under it knows. Somebody was thinking of the one who'd sleep cold. Somebody they never met. Nobody sleeps unloved under a sparrow. 30 years of quilts had gone out of Martha Hale's hands into the mission barrels, into the wagons, west with settlers, and north with cattle crews, each one carrying its small red bird. Where they had all flown to, God alone kept the list. Remember the sparrow. The story is not finished with it. And the candle in the window, the one light burning at the end of the darkest street in Montana. Understand, it was one of the last 3 candles in the house, and she was burning it in an empty window while she herself sat in firelight to spare it. That was her mother's custom too, carried from Missouri, and older than Missouri. Old country old. On Christmas Eve, you set a light in the window. The light says, "This house does not turn away travelers tonight." The light is for Mary and Joseph, still looking for room. The light is so that no one, her mother's exact words, no one passes a dark house on the night the world got its second chance. Thomas used to tease her about it, gently every year of their marriage, burning good tallow for 2 people who found lodging 1800 years back. And every year she lit it anyway, and every year he was secretly glad, because a man likes to be married to a woman who keeps faith with something. 2 years a widow now, 11 months past David. The mortgage letter on the mantel and 30 cents in the tin. She had eaten smaller and smaller suppers all December, so the flour would last to February. She lit the candle at dusk, same as every year. If anything, she set it half an inch closer to the glass. The knock, when it came, was so faint, she took it for snow sliding off the roof. Then it came again, twice, low on the door, the knock of a hand that has been refused all night and has quit hoping, knocking now the way a clock ticks, out of plain momentum. Martha Hale did not call out, "Who's there?" She did not go to the window first, and she did not take the stove poker in her hand, though a woman alone at the edge of town had every earthly right to do both. Afterward, when the whole valley knew this story and people asked her, and they did ask for years, why she opened her door wide open at full dark on the strength of a beggar's knock, she gave the same answer every time, in the voice of a woman explaining that water is wet. "I had a candle in the window. You can't set out a light and then not answer it. That's lying to God." She opened the door. The cold came in first, and then the sight of him. A tall old man gone to bones, white to the eyebrows with snow, one hand against the door frame to hold the world steady. She saw the boots first. She was a mending woman. She read people from the ground up. Boots split at both seams, laced with string, a day from killing their owner. She saw the coat that had been through 2 other men. She saw the grey in his face that was not cold, and the way his chest laboured, and last she saw his eyes, which were pale blue, and which were looking at her. No, past her. At the room, at the fire, the quilt frame, the one set table. Looking at plain, warm human indoors, the way starving men look at bread. "Mrs.," he got out hoarse as a crow, "I saw your light. I'll not trouble you long. If I could sit in your barn out of the wind, I'd be gone by first." "There's no fire in the barn," said Martha Hale, and stood aside and held her door, her last of everything, mortgaged, grieving door, wide open to the night. "Supper's near ready. You'll want to shed those boots." 60 seconds, 12 doors, and 4 hours on the richest street in the valley. 60 seconds and 1 sentence at the poorest. That is the whole of it. That is the hinge this story turns on, and heaven's arithmetic was already carrying the one. She fed him her own supper and called it extra. He would have known it for a lie if he'd had his wits, for no woman alive cooks extra out of half a sack of flour, but he was past reading anything but the spoon. She put the salt pork in the beans, the whole knuckle, February be hanged, and cut the bread she had baked for her own Christmas dinner. And when he finally sat back, she was already at the hearth with his ruined boots, turning them over in the firelight, reading the seams the way a doctor reads a chest. "These'll take waxed thread," she said, mostly to herself, "and an awl. You'd have lost toes by Bozeman." "Wasn't going to Bozeman," the old man said. The fire cracked. "Wasn't going anywhere. Tell the truth of it. This valley, I knew it once, a long while back. Thought I'd see it again before." He let the sentence go, where such sentences go by themselves, into the fire. Martha looked up from the boots. She had buried enough of her own to know the sound of a man setting his affairs in order, not money affairs, the other kind. But her mother had raised her that a guest's business is his own, until he hands it to you. So she asked the only thing a Christian must ask. "What do I call you?" "Josiah," he said. "Josiah what?" The old man looked into the fire for a long moment, and something moved through his face like wind over a wheat field. You could not have said what it was, only that it had been a large thing once. "Just Josiah, ma'am," he said at last. The rest of it I gave away a long time ago." And up on the hill at the far end of town, in the finest house for 80 miles, the last party guests were calling their good nights into the cold, and Silas Crane stood alone at his tall window, with a glass in his hand, looking down the dark length of Main Street at the one small light still burning by the creek, and could not for the life of him say why he kept looking at it. He did not sleep so much as lose consciousness by degrees, there in the chair by the fire, and Martha Hale sat up with him the whole of that Christmas night, the way she had once sat up with her own. She knew the work. You keep the fire fed, and you keep the cloth cool, and you listen to the breathing, the way a sailor listens to the wind, for the change in it before it comes. Toward 3, the fever climbed, and he talked, not to her, to people who were not in the room. And toward dawn it broke a little, and he slept honest. She used the quiet to see to his boots. She had said she would, and she was not a woman who said a thing and let it lie. By firelight she worked the wax thread through the split seams with the curved awl that had been Thomas's, and she greased the leather with the last of the tallow she could spare, and she set them by the hearth to firm. It was slow work, and her eyes were not young. She did not mind. Her hands were happiest doing, and there had been little enough for them to mend that mattered, this last hard year. When the grey came up in the one window, the candle long since burned to a button of wax she had let go all the way down, for you do not snuff the Christmas light. You let it choose its own hour. She looked over and found his pale eyes open, watching her hands. "You mended my boots," he said, the way a man says a thing he does not believe. "I mend," she said. "It's what I've got." Morning was Christmas, and there was nobody in the world to know it but the two of them. Word travels in a snowbound town, the way damp travels through a wall, slow, and into everything. It was the Kellerman boy who carried it first, sent down the second day past Christmas to fetch back a harness strap, who saw the old man at the Widow Hale's woodpile with an axe, splitting kindling, cutting clean. He told it, at the mercantile, the way a boy tells a thing, for the pleasure of being the one who knew. Pruitt made it better in the retelling, which is to say worse. By the time it had gone the round of the stove twice, the Widow Hale had taken in the very tramp who tried to rob the town at Christmas, was feeding him out of a flour barrel everyone knew was near empty. And here the voices dropped to the register, reserved for the truly satisfying. A widow, mind you, alone at the edge of town, with a strange man under her roof, and no one to say a word about the propriety of it. At her age, said Mrs. Ainsley, and then, being not an entirely bad woman, was ashamed of it, and said no more, and thought instead about a bowl of stew she had once held in a doorway, and could not seem to set down. This is worth putting in the ledger plainly, for the town will look better later, and we must not cheat it of looking bad now. Not one of them, hearing that the poorest woman among them had opened her door to a dying man, felt shame. They felt the other thing, the thing people feel when someone poorer, and with far less reason, has done the decent thing they did not do. They called it concern. Its right name was something else. And so the talk went up Main Street, gathering as it went, toward the big house on the hill. where all the town's business ended sooner or later. He could not be still. That was the first thing she learned about him. Once the fever had loosened its grip enough to let a man be himself. A body that has walked 40 years does not know how to sit in a warm room and be waited on. It shames him. So on the third day, when she came in from the cow, she found him at the mantel, with the works of her dead clock spread out on a square of flannel, the wheels laid in a row from largest to smallest, in order, the way a man lays out tools he means to answer for. That clock had not run since the winter Thomas died. She had meant to carry it to town to be seen to, and had never had the coin to spare for the seeing. She opened her mouth to say let it be, an old clock was no matter, and closed it again because she had watched his hands. They were ruined hands, older than the rest of him, swollen at the joints, 2 nails gone black. But they moved over those small brass wheels with a sureness the rest of the man had lost, a memory that lived below the fever and below the 40 years. And she knew that kind of knowing when she saw it. Her father had built barns. She had grown up watching hands that knew a thing so deep. The man could do it dying. You were a maker of things, she said. It was not a question. He did not look up. I was a great many things, he said, before I was this. He seated a wheel on its pin and turned it once with a fingertip, and somewhere inside the case, a tooth met a tooth that had not met in 2 years. A man's hands don't forget. It's the rest of him that does the forgetting. That evening the clock ticked. She wept a little over the supper pot where he could not see, for no reason she could have named, unless it was the sound of time starting again in a house where it had stopped. The cabin door had never hung true. Thomas had set it himself in a hurry their first autumn, with green lumber and the snow coming, and it had sagged on its hinges ever since, so that it dragged the sill and let in a blade of wind at the top corner all winter long. 26 years Martha had shouldered that door and stuffed that corner with rag, and had long ago stopped seeing it as a fault, the way you stop seeing a limp in someone you love. Josiah saw it in a morning. She watched him stand before it and look at it the way she looked at a torn seam, reading how it had gone wrong, and back of that, reading the man who had hung it, forgiving him for it in the same glance, because green lumber and coming snow will beat any man. He lifted the door off its pins with a grunt that cost him, and he planed the swollen edge with the draw knife she kept for shingles, and he whittled a shim for the low hinge, and he hung it back. It closed. For the first time in 26 years, it closed sweet, with a small sound, like a book laid shut, and the blade of wind at the top corner was gone. Martha stood and looked at the closed door and could not speak for a moment. It was such a small thing. It was the smallest thing in the world. Her husband had promised to fix it, and had died with it unfixed, the way men die with the small promises still owing while they see to the large ones. And here a stranger had done it in a morning, asking nothing, to pay for beans and a corner of her floor. Thomas always meant to see to that, she said finally. I know, said Josiah, gathering the shavings into his palm to feed the fire, wasting nothing. A man means to. There's a whole house a man means to fix, given time. Something crossed his face. Given time. Now we must climb the hill, into the big house, and look at Silas Crane, and the story will try to do it honestly, which with Crane is the hardest honesty of all. He was 48, and he was cold, and he had built himself into the most important man in the valley, the way a man builds a wall against the sea. One stone at a time, all his life, never finished. He held paper on nearly every roof in Hollow Creek. He was not cruel for the pleasure of it. That is too easy a thing to say of a man. And this story will not buy its villain cheap. He was a man who had decided, a long time ago, and all the way down, that the world gives you nothing and takes everything, and that the only safety is to be the one who holds the note. He had learned that lesson young. He had learned it, though the town did not know this, and neither yet do you, from a locked door. When the talk reached him, brought up the hill by his clerk with the small pleasure clerks taking the misfortunes of the poor, that the widow Hale had a strange old man installed in her cabin, Crane set down his pen and felt a thing he could not account for. A cold draught in a warm room. He put it down to business. The Hale note was due the 1st of April, and a woman feeding 2 mouths out of nothing would default the surer for it, and a defaulted property with frontage on the creek was worth having. That is what he told himself. That is what he wrote in the ledger of his own heart, where the arithmetic had been wrong for 40 years, and had never once been audited. Ready the notice of demand on the Hale place, he told the clerk, and have my horse. I'll carry it myself. He had never carried a notice himself in his life. He came on the 4th day, on a good horse, in a coat that cost more than the cabin it stopped before. Martha met him in the yard, because you do not make a man like Crane come to your door. You go out to keep your door your own. Josiah was inside, abed with the fever risen again, and she pulled the mended door shut behind her. Sweet and quiet the new-hung door, and stood in the snow with her hands folded in her apron. Mrs. Hale. Crane did not dismount. Men who mean to keep the high ground do not dismount. I'll not waste your morning. There's talk you've taken in a drifter, a man of no means and less character. I've taken in a sick old man, Martha said. Christmas Eve. He'd have died in the road. That's your affair. I'm here about the note. He drew the paper from his coat, and it was the same tight hand, S. Crane, that she read on her mantle every night. April 1st. I'll be plain since you're a plain woman. A widow alone might find the bank inclined to patience. A widow keeping a stranger, feeding a grown man out of a barrel she can't fill. That's not hardship, that's foolishness, and the bank does not extend patience to foolishness. Turn him out or don't. But the note comes due the same, and I'll not carry you a day past it. Martha looked up at him a long moment. She was not a woman who frightened, having already lost the things fear is made of. And she saw, though she could not have said how she saw it, that the man on the horse was more afraid than she was. Of what, she did not know. Mr. Crane, she said, you sent me no letter when my David died in your snow. You'll forgive me if I don't take my instruction from you on who to let in from the cold. The word David went across his face like a slap. He wheeled the horse and rode and left the notice fluttering in the snow, and she let it lie there a long time before she picked it up. The fever kept him down 3 days after that, and it was in those days that the story turned on its hinge a second time. He had a pack, a canvas roll, gone the grey of everything he owned, that he kept by the chair, and would not let her carry, weak as he was, until the weakness took even that from him. On the second day of the new lying down, needing to wash what could be washed, she untied it. A man's whole estate was in that roll, and it was a poor one, a tin cup worn through and mended with a hammered coin, a broken cased watch that did not run, a Bible smaller than her own, a letter gone soft as cloth at the folds that she did not open, for a guest's business is his own, and at the bottom, folded small and carried careful, a quilt. She knew it was a quilt before she had it half unrolled, by the give of it in her hands. The particular yield of pieced cloth and cotton batting that no other thing in the world has. She unfolded it on the table to shake it out and mend what wanted mending. This old blanket that had plainly kept a man alive through more winters than it had any right to. It was worn near to gauze. It was patched with patches. But the piecing under the patching was a piecing she knew. The broken dishes pattern her mother had favored, the way the corners were turned. And her hands slowed, and something began to go cold and very still in her chest, the way the creek goes still just before it locks over with ice. She turned the quilt to its bottom corner, to where the pattern ended, to where, on every quilt that had left her hands in 30 years, she had set one small thing. There, in the corner, worn pale but there, was a sparrow stitched in red thread. Her sparrow. Not her mother's. She knew her own hand from her mother's the way you know your own voice on the wind from a stranger's. The particular slant of the tail, the French knot she used for the eye, which her mother had never used. She had set that bird there herself. She had sat by a fire and pushed that red thread through that cloth with her own scarred fingers. And she had not the least memory of which winter it was, because there had been 30 winters and 100 quilts, and everyone had gone out of her hands, into the church barrel and west into the world, to strangers she would never meet, and God alone had kept the list. One of them had come back. She sat down slowly at the table with the quilt in her lap. She thought of the old man in the next room, coughing his colored cough, who had come down over the Wolf Ridge Trail in December to die, and had walked into the one house in a valley of 2,000 souls, where the woman who made the thing that kept him from freezing sat sewing another one just like it. She thought of the wagons gone north, with the cattle crews, the settlers west, the mission barrels emptied into the whole hard country. She thought of a blizzard somewhere, Wyoming she would learn, a line camp in the Wind River country, a winter 20 years gone, when a man with nothing had been handed a blanket from a charity barrel by hands that never knew his name. Remember the sparrow, the story said, a long time ago now, when the old man was still only a stranger on a road. This story was not finished with it. Kindness is not lost. That was the whole of the lesson, and Martha Hale learned it with a worn quilt in her lap and her hands gone still. You put it out into the dark, into the barrel, the wagon, the world, expecting nothing, and it goes where you cannot follow. And 40 years later, on the worst night of a stranger's life, it comes walking back down your own road on ruined boots to knock at your door. She did not tell him at first. She folded the quilt and set it back in the pack, and she went and stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at him sleeping. This stranger who was not a stranger, this man her hands had reached across 20 years and 1,000 miles to keep alive, without either of them knowing it. She told him on the 5th evening, when he was clear again, propped in the chair with his hands around the mended tin cup. She brought the quilt out and laid it across his knees and put her finger on the red bird, and she said, "I made this." He looked at it a long time. He was an old man and had learned to receive hard things quietly, but she saw his throat work. "Wind River country," he said at last. "The winter of '68. I'd lost everything a second time by then. The first time to my own fault. The second to a claim that flooded out. I was 30 miles from any fire, and it came on to blow, and I lay up in a line shack that had no door, and a freighter had left a bundle from a church barrel on the bunk. I was too far gone to be grateful. I just pulled it over me." His ruined finger found the sparrow next to hers. "I woke up. I've wondered ever since what fool woman sews a bird on a blanket meant for a barrel. Wondered it 20 years. So somebody sleeping cold would know," Martha said in her mother's words, "that somebody was thinking of him. Somebody they never met." The fire spoke in the grate. The new-hung door held out the wind. Two old people sat with a worn quilt between them and the enormous quiet arithmetic of it. That a kindness given away for nothing, expecting nothing, remembered by no one, had crossed 20 years to bring its maker the one guest who would ever truly need her. "I never got to thank her," Josiah said. "You're thanking her," said Martha. "Eat your supper." After that, the wall in him came down, not all at once, but in pieces, the way a man tears down a wall he built himself, carefully, knowing where the heavy stones are. It came in fragments over the evenings that followed, between the coughing and the long silences. And the story will give it to you the way she got it, in pieces, because that is the honest way. And because some things ought not be told smooth. He had been a young man once, with a young man's hands, a carpenter, a good one, out of Ohio. He had gone to the war. He did not say much of the war, and she did not ask. She had nursed enough men who had been to a war to know that the ones who say least saw most. He came home from it changed. The way they all came home changed, with a coldness in him, where the belief used to be, and a wife he had married before the guns, and a boy born while he was away, a son he met when the child was 2, and did not, he confessed, feel toward as a man ought to feel. "The war took something out of me. I never did get back," he said, looking into the fire. "A man ought to come home and be glad. I came home and felt like I was standing outside my own window, looking in at people I couldn't get to. And then the gold. In '59, the news came of the strikes out west, and the coldness in him found a shape to pour itself into. Not greed, he said, and she believed him. It was worse than greed. It was a hope that if he could only get enough, get out ahead of the world's taking, he would feel warm again, feel like a man standing inside his own house instead of out in the yard of it. He had a wife who wept, and a son who did not know him, and a good trade in his 2 hands, and he left it all standing and went west after a color in the ground. "I told her a year," he said. "I told her 1 year, and I'd come back a made man. The 1 year became 2, and the 2 became 5. He did not write. A man ashamed of having found nothing does not write. And then a man ashamed of not having written does not write. And the silence builds its own wall, stone on stone, until it is easier to be dead to them than to explain. He chased the color from camp to camp down 20 years, always nearly rich, always broke by spring. And the wife and the boy back in Ohio became a thing he did not let himself think of. The way you do not press a bad tooth with your tongue. Then, in a silver camp in Idaho in the year 79, the mountain finally opened its hand. He struck it deep and true, the thing he had bled his whole life for. He was, inside of 1 year, a rich man. Richer than Crane, richer than any man in this valley would ever be. And he stood in an assay office with a paper in his hand that said he had won at last, the thing he had thrown his life away to get, and found that the warmth did not come. So I went home, he said. First time in 20 years, rich as Solomon, going to set it all right with money, the way I'd always meant to. He was quiet a while. You'll have guessed. The house was somebody else's. She'd been 10 years in the ground. Died poor, they told me, of a lung sickness, in a rented room, taking in washing. And the boy, his voice, which had held level through the war and the gold and the 20 years, went at last. The boy was grown and gone, left the day he was old enough, took his mother's name and swore off mine, and no one could tell me where, or would. He looked at his ruined hands, that had built houses and dug mountains and held at the end nothing. I had a fortune and no one to give it to, so I gave it away, every dollar. Kept back one thing, one deed, for a reason I'll come to, and I put on another man's coat, and I've walked ever since. 40 years I've been walking, missus. A man can walk a long way, looking for a door that's shut for good. He did not get better. She had known from the first night, from the color of the cough, the way she had known things about seams and boots her whole life, the truth that lives in the hands before it reaches the head. But knowing a thing and watching it come are two different rivers, and she had crossed the first long ago, and was in the second now, and there is no bridge over that one. You wade it. January came down hard on the valley, the second hard winter running, and the drifts climbed the north wall of the cabin, and inside it the old man grew smaller. The fever came and went like a tide, and on the good days he was clear and even easy, and would sit with the clock he had mended, listening to it, or tell her small true things about the country he had crossed. On the bad days, he was not in the room at all, but somewhere back down the 40 years, and he spoke to people the fire's light could not reach. She fed him what there was, and the barrel went down, and she did not once think of the note, or of April, or of the man on the hill. There are seasons in a life when the ledger goes quiet, when the small, hard arithmetic of getting by simply stops, because a larger sum is being reckoned. Martha Hale had a dying man in her house, and a worn quilt with her own Sparrow on it, folded under his head. And the poorest woman in the valley had never in her life felt herself the keeper of anything so valuable. You ought to turn me out, he told her once, clear-eyed in the middle of it. I've cost you the note. I've cost you your good name in that town. I've brought you nothing but a mouth to feed and a grave to dig. You brought my Sparrow home, she said, and wrung the cloth and laid it cool across his brow. Hush now, you'll wake the cow. It was the last week of January, in the black middle of a night, when he called out the name. The fever had him deep. He had been muttering for an hour, the way he did, to the people who were not there, to a foreman, to a man named Co, about a claim, once terribly, to a woman he called only girl, asking her forgiveness in a voice that made Martha set down her sewing and press her knuckles to her mouth. She had learned to let it go past her, most of it, the flood rack of a long life coming loose in the dark. Then he went rigid in the bed, and his ruined hand came up off the quilt and reached towards something at the foot of it, and he called out, clear. This once, clear as a struck bell, in the voice of a man calling across a great distance to someone walking away. One name. Silas. And then, breaking on it, Silas, son, don't shut the... Martha Hale sat very still. The fire ticked. The clock he had mended ticked. Outside, the wind went along the north wall, hunting the corner he had closed. And she sat in her chair, with the needle stopped in the cloth, and the whole warm room gone cold around her. Because in all the valley of Hollow Creek, in all the 80 miles of it, there was only one man who bore that name. There was only one Silas. She looked at the old man in the bed, at the pale eyes, the carpenter's hands, the fortune given away and the one deed kept back, the son who took his mother's name and swore off his father's, the 40 years of walking toward a door, shut for good. She looked at him, and the arithmetic she had refused to do for a month finished itself all at once, the way a long sum comes right in a single terrible instant. And she knew whose father lay dying in her bed. She knew whose door it was that had shut on him first, on Christmas Eve, at the top of the town. Morning came the way mornings do, even after the nights that ought to stop them, grey and ordinary over the snow. And the old man came back up out of the fever into a clear day, one of the last clear days he would have, and did not know what he had said in the dark. But Martha knew, and a thing once known cannot be unknown, and she was not a woman who could sit across a table from a truth and pretend the chair was empty. So while he took his broth, she asked him quietly, the way you lift a bandage you know is stuck, Josiah, this son of yours, the one you couldn't find. She kept her eyes on the mending in her lap. What was his given name? The spoon stopped. A long moment went by with the mended clock filling it. Silas, he said, for his grandfather. He'd not have kept it, though. He took his mother's people's name when he left. Crane. He said it without weight, a fact worn smooth by 40 years of carrying. Sarah's name. He'd be a Crane now, wherever he is, if he's living. Martha Hale set down her needle. Outside the window, the smoke of the town stood up straight in the cold, and at the head of it, on the hill, the smoke of the biggest chimney of all. Josiah, she said, and her voice was gentle, for she was about to hand a dying man the one thing he had walked 40 years to find, and the one thing that would break what was left of his heart, both in the same breath. Josiah, I know where your son is. He looked at her without understanding, the way a man looks at a word in a language he used to speak. He's here. He's been here the whole while. He's the richest man in this valley. He holds the paper on every house in it, this one among them, the letter on my mantle, the note that comes due in April. His hand signed it. She made herself say the rest. The big house at the top of the town, the fine one with the gables. That's his. The old man's face did not change all at once. It changed the way ice changes on a pond in a thaw. From the inside, a great silent working under a surface that has not yet broken. The big house, Josiah said, at the top of the town. Tell me the look of it. So she told him. The steep gables, the deep porch, the oak door and the fine turned rails, and the way it sat above the street like a church above a graveyard. She told it plainly. And as she told it, she watched a thing come up in his ruined face that she had not seen there before, not through all the fever and the confession. A kind of wonder, terrible and soft. "Is there a star?" he said. His voice had gone to almost nothing. Above the door, a little star, cut into the wood over the frame. You'd hardly see it now. It'd be under the paint. Martha did not know. She had never in her life gone up the walk of the Crane house. Her kind did not. But she did not need to have seen it. She saw it now in his face, which was certainty itself. "I carved that star," Josiah said, "with a chisel my own father left me, into the doorframe of the house I built for my wife and my son 40 years ago. Before the war, before the gold, before I threw the whole of it into a hole in the ground and walked away. I built that house with these." He turned his hands over in his lap. "I set that door. I cut that star so my boy, coming home of an evening, would look up and know his father made a bright thing over the way in. And the story, which has kept honest accounts from its first word, will ask you now to remember the very first thing you were ever told. An old man in the snow, on Christmas Eve, looking up at the finest house in Hollow Creek, the way no beggar looks at a rich man's house, the way a man looks at something he built with his own hands. He'd been looking at his own door. His son had shut it in his face. You would think a man might rage, learning that the son he had crossed a continent of years to find had stood behind that oak door on Christmas Eve and said, "Not tonight, old man," and let the latch fall. But Josiah did not rage. He was past the age and past the strength of it, and besides, the story must tell you plainly, he did not think he had the right. "He didn't know me," Josiah said. "How would he know me? I'm a beggar," he turned off his porch. "But I knew that porch. God help me. I stood in the yard and knew it and thought I'd gone soft in the head." He was quiet. Then he shut the door the way I taught the whole world to shut it. "I shut the first one, missus, 40 years ago. All the doors since are only that one door, closing and closing." He wanted to see him. That was the whole of it. The small, enormous wish of a dying man. Not to reclaim, not to reproach, not to hand over a fortune he no longer had. Only to look on his son's face once. Living before he went where you cannot bring your regrets. To say if he was let, the thing he had said to the empty dark in his fever, "I'm sorry," to a face that could hear it. Martha Hale looked at him a long while. She thought of the man on the good horse who had left a notice fluttering in her yard. She thought of David under the fence post, and the saddle charged against his wages. She thought that of all the people in the world, to carry a dying beggar up the hill to the door of the hardest man in the valley, God had a strange sense of whom to choose. "All right," she said. "When you're strong enough for it, I'll take you myself." The strong enough day did not come. What came instead was a morning he could stand, leaning on her, and they both knew there would be no better one. So they took it. It was the first week of February, and bitter, and the two of them going up Main Street made a sight the town would not forget. The widow Hale, in her dead husband's coat, and on her arm, an old man wrapped in a quilt, with a red bird in the corner of it. The pair of them stopping every few rods for him to get his breath. Going up the middle of the street slow as a funeral, because a funeral was near enough what it was. They passed the Mercantile. Pruitt came to the glass and looked out and did not open the door. They passed the church and the parsonage, where a curtain moved. Word ran up the hill ahead of them, the way it always ran, so that by the time they reached the foot of the crane walk, there were faces at a dozen windows behind them. The whole frightened, comfortable town watching to see what the poorest woman in it meant to do at the door of the richest man. Martha did not look at them. She had a dying man on her arm and a hill to climb. And the walk up to the crane house was long and steep and swept clean of snow. And they went up it a step at a time, the old man's breath tearing, the quilt slipping from his shoulders so that she had to stop and settle it again. At the top he stopped and would not go on for a moment, and she thought his strength had failed at last. But it was not that. He was looking up, above the oak door in the frame, painted over these many years, but there to a man who knew where to look, a small carved star. There it is, Josiah said softly, to no one, to himself, to 40 years. There's the star. Then he squared what was left of his shoulders, the way a man does before a thing he has dreaded and wanted in equal measure his whole life, and he lifted his ruined hand, and he knocked on his own front door. There was a wait. Then the oak door opened, and Silas Crane stood in it. He was dressed for his warm indoors, and behind him the story could see, the same as 40 years of Christmases could see. The fine hall, the good fire, the comfort a man builds against the sea. He looked at the widow Hale on his step with a dying tramp on her arm, wrapped in a beggar's quilt, and his face closed like a ledger. He did not know the man. Understand that. The story insists upon it, for it is the whole of the sorrow. He did not see his father. 40 years and a fortune and a beggar's ruin stood between the face on the step and the young, strong father in the one memory he had refused to keep. He saw a sick old vagrant his soft-hearted debtor had dragged to his door to work on his charity, and he had built his whole life on the principle that charity is a tax the weak try to lay on the strong, and he would not pay it. "I've no work and no coin for drifters," Crane said. "Mrs. Hale, this is beneath even you. Take him to the county, if the county will have him, not here." The old man lifted his head. He looked up at his son, up, for the son stood on the step above him, and he opened his mouth to say the name or the thing or the 40 years. And Martha, watching, saw him decide not to, saw him choose at the last, not to buy his welcome with acclaim, not to say "I am your father," and watch the weight of it land on a face that had shut so many doors. He only looked. He only wanted the once, the face living. And Silas Crane, meeting the pale eyes of the beggar on his step, and feeling again that cold draught in the warm room, and hating it, said the words this story began with, the words that fall in this family the way snow falls. "Not tonight, old man. Go on now." And he shut the door, and the latch fell. For a moment the old man stood facing the shut oak with the carved star above it, and Martha stood beside him, and neither moved. The town watched from its dozen windows and saw only a beggar turned off a rich man's porch, a common sight, and went back to its fires, disappointed of a spectacle. They did not see what Martha saw. They did not see the old man lift his ruined hand and lay it flat against the door, not to knock again, only to touch it, the wood of it, the door he had hung 40 years ago and true, for his had always hung true, and hold it there a moment, the way you lay a hand on the shoulder of someone who will not turn around. They did not hear what he said, which was not a reproach, and was not the name, and was so quiet that Martha herself was never wholly sure she had heard it right. "It closes well," was what she thought he said. "The boy keeps it closing well." Then he took his hand from the door and let her turn him, and they went back down the long swept walk, and down the hill, and down the length of Main Street past the windows, slower than they had come, the quilt slipping and slipping. He did not speak the whole way. He had had his once. He had looked on his son's living face and heard his son's voice, even if the voice had said, "Go on now." And for a man who had walked 40 years toward a shut door, it may be that being turned away by the living is a better thing than never coming to the door at all. The story does not know. The story only keeps the account. It sets this down and lets it stand. He touched the door, and he said it closed well, and he did not once, going down that hill, look back. He took to the bed for the last time that night, and did not rise from it again. The going was slow, and it was gentle, which is more than many are given, and Martha Hale nursed him down to the end, the way she had nursed him up from the first night. The barrel was near empty. She did not think of it. The note was near due. She did not think of that either. She sat with him through the first days of February, while the clock he had mended told off the hours, and she sewed. What else? Her hands would sew at the gates of heaven. And once, when he watched her, she saw that it was a sparrow she was setting into the corner of the cloth, and that he was watching her make it, and that this pleased him past any words either of them had. On the last evening he was very clear. The fever had gone out of him and left him light and easy, the way a coal goes soft and grey at the end. He asked her to open the window a crack, though it was bitter, so he could hear the creak. She opened it. He listened to the water moving under its ice, the same water of the Wolfridge Springs, and something in his ruined face eased all the way out. "You know," he said, "I've slept in 40 years of places, never once thought of a one of them as anywhere. And I come down over that ridge to die, and I find—" He stopped and gathered it and gave it to her plain, the way she gave things. "I find the woman that sewed the bird that saved my life, and my own boy's door, and a warm room, and you, in the poorest house in the valley." He closed his eyes. "Home at last. Isn't that the joke of it? 40 years, and home was the last door, and it was the poor one." He said nothing after that. He listened to the creak, and a while after the candle had burned itself down to the button, quiet without any struggle in it, the breathing that Martha had listened to for 6 weeks, the way a sailor listens to the wind, simply between one tick of the clock and the next, was not there anymore. She washed him and laid him out herself, for there was no one to send for, and no one she would have sent for. She dressed him in Thomas's good shirt, the one she had kept back these 2 years for a burying, and had thought would be her own. She folded his ruined hands on his breast, the carpenter's hands, and she put into them nothing, for he had wanted nothing, and given all, and she covered him to the chin with the sparrow quilt, his and hers, the one that had crossed 20 years, because a thing that has kept a man warm that long has earned the right to see him the rest of the way. The ground was iron. The Kellerman men came, shamed into it at last, and it took 3 days of fire on the frozen earth to open a grave, up on the little rise above the creek where Thomas lay, and where, under a stone she had scratched herself with a nail, a space had been kept that everyone understood was David's, though David was 3 miles off under Crane's snow, and had never been brought home. They put the old man there, between her husband and the empty place kept for her son. The Reverend Ainsley came, unasked, and stood in the cold with his hat off, and read the words, and did not meet Martha's eye. And there was a bowl of stew in the way he read them, that only he and she, and one other soul in the valley could have understood. When it was done and the men had gone, Martha stood alone by the raw dark scar in the white ground. She had buried her husband. She had lost her son to the snow. And now she had buried a stranger who was not a stranger, a beggar with a fortune given away, and a star carved over another man's door. And she found that her eyes were dry and that she was not sorrowful exactly, but full. Full the way the creek is full under the ice, moving where you cannot see it. She had kept a candle in a window. She had answered it. She had not, whatever the town would say, come out the poorer. She went down to the cabin and she wound the clock. Winter broke at last, the way even the hardest winter finally must, and the creek came loose and ran loud, and the Wolf Ridge springs at the head of the valley opened and sent their water down through every ranch and every town lot in Hollow Creek the way they had since, before there was a Hollow Creek to speak of. It was April. The note came due on the first of it, and Martha did not pay it, having nothing, and she waited for the foreclosure the way you wait for weather. What came up her road instead, on the 4th of April, was a hired rig from the stage road, and out of it a spare grey man in a town coat and spectacles, carrying a leather case, who picked his way across her muddy yard and asked whether she was Mrs. Martha Hale, widow, who had these several weeks past given shelter to a man called Josiah. She said she was. He was a lawyer, he said, out of Helena, and he had been 6 weeks trying to find the old man, having had a letter from him in the winter, the soft folded letter she understood now, that had lain in the pack she would not open. He was sorry to hear the man was dead. It changed nothing in the instrument. He opened his case on her one table and drew out papers gone brown at the edges, and among them, the thing the old man had kept back when he gave away the whole of his fortune. The one deed, the reason. It was a homestead patent, and a grant of water rights filed under the territorial law and never once relinquished, 40 years standing, ironclad, to the springs at Wolf Ridge and the whole flow that came off them, which was to say, the lawyer explained, adjusting his spectacles, in the spring light of the poorest cabin in the valley, to every drop of water in Hollow Creek. The creek, the town wells, stock water on every ranch for 40 miles. He has left it entire, said the lawyer, to you. Martha Hale sat down at her own table. She was not a lettered woman, but she had not lived 55 years on the frontier without understanding what water is in a dry country. Water is everything. A man may own the finest range in the territory, and if the water that crosses it belongs to another, then he is a tenant on his own ground, and holds it only so long as the other allows. Every ranch in the valley watered its stock on the flow off Wolf Ridge. The town drank it. Crane's Bank held the paper on the land, yes, but the land was worth the water on it and nothing more. And the water had belonged for 40 years to a beggar who died in the widow Hale's bed, and belonged now to the widow herself. The whole valley, which had shut 12 doors on the old man, lay in the palm of the woman who had opened the one. And Silas Crane, the story must be exact here, for this is the pivot of everything. Silas Crane was ruined by it, or as good as. His wealth was land, and the notes on land, and land without water is dust. And if the widow Hale chose to close her hand, every acre he held was worth a fraction of the debt he had borrowed against it. The richest man in the valley held paper on a desert. The clerk who brought the news up the hill did not this time take any pleasure in it. Even a clerk knew enough to be frightened. By the second week of April, the whole town knew, the way the whole town always knew. And the whole town, having watched the widow Hale carry a dying beggar to Crane's door and be turned away, having deducted a dead boy's saddle and shut its 12 doors and slid its bolts home, understood exactly what was coming now, because it was what they themselves would have done. They waited for her revenge, and she had cause. The story will not pretend she did not, or that the thought never came to her, for that would be a lie, and this account keeps honest books to the last line. She had cause enough to sink the whole hill. Here was the man whose foreman had ridden her David out into weather that killed him, and whose office had charged the boy's own wages for the saddle he froze in. Here was the son who had shut the door on his own father, twice, once 40 years in the making, and once with the man dying on the step, and never known it. If Martha Hale had closed her hand on the water, and let Silas Crane fall, as far as his own hardness had built him high, there was not a court in the territory, nor a soul in the valley, that would have called it anything but justice. For 3 days she sat with it. She wound the clock, and milked the cow, and sowed her sparrows, and sat with it. She read the mortgage letter on her mantle, and she read, in her memory, the 12 shut doors, and the notice in the snow, and she weighed them against a worn quilt with a red bird in the corner, and against an old man's ruined hand laid flat on his own front door, saying it closes well. The boy keeps it closing well. She thought of her mother's voice. Nobody sleeps unloved under a sparrow. She thought that a sparrow is a small thing to sow, and costs almost nothing, and goes out into the dark expecting nothing back, and that this was the same stitch, only larger, the same thread, only longer. She had spent 30 years sowing the belief that a kindness put out into the dark comes home, and she had held the proof of it folded under a dying man's head all winter, and a belief you will not act on when it costs you is not a belief at all. It is only a decoration, a bird sewn on for pretty. On the 4th day she put on her coat and walked up the hill. She had the lawyer draw the papers first in Helena's proper language, so there could be no undoing them and no mistaking them. And she carried them up the swept walk and knocked on the oak door under the carved star. And this time, it was not shut in her face. This time they brought her into the fine hall, the widow Hale, in her dead husband's coat, standing on the turkey carpet her son had watched a beggar turned away from. And Silas Crane received her standing, because a man receives standing, the one who holds his life in her hand. He had had 2 weeks to know his ruin. It was in his face, under the coldness, the way water shows under ice. He meant to bargain. She saw him gather himself to bargain, to find the price. For he was a man who believed all the way down that everything has a price, and that safety is being the one who names it. She did not let him. She laid the papers on his fine table and told him plainly, in the voice she used for saying that water is wet, what she had done. She had forgiven the debts. Not his to her only, all of them. Every note the water gave her power over, every mortgage that hung now on her goodwill. She had signed away the leverage of forgiven, released. The Hale note foremost, her own, but not only hers. The Kellerman place, the Ainsleys, the Livery, Pruitt's, the whole frightened, comfortable street that had shut its doors. She had lifted her hand off the water and let it run free to every acre it had always run to, and taken back nothing, and bound not one of them to a thing. Crane looked at the papers a long time. When he found his voice, it was not the banker's voice. It was thin. "What are your conditions?" he said. "There aren't any," said Martha Hale. "There are always conditions." "Not this time," she said. "That's rather the point of it." And that was the thing his father's money had never once been able to buy him, offered now across a fine table by the poorest woman in the valley, for nothing, asking nothing, a thing given with no price on it. He had built his whole life on the certainty that no such thing existed, that charity was a debt in disguise, and love a lever, and every open hand a hand that would close, because the first door of his life had shut on him and taught him so. His own father's door, though he had it backwards, and always would have. But for what came next? For Martha Hale, being an honest woman to the marrow, did not leave him in his ignorance. She had not come only to forgive a debt. Standing in the hall of the house his father built, she told him whose the beggar had been. The old man he had turned off his step with, go on now. The old man dying at that very hour 3 miles down the hill in her bed. She told him of the war, and the gold, and the fortune given away, and the 40 years of walking, and the one deed kept back. She told him of a ruined hand, laid flat against this very oak door. It closes well. The boy keeps it closing well. And she told him to look up, next time he came in of an evening, at the little star carved over his own door, and to know that his father had cut it there with his own chisel 40 years ago, so that his boy coming home would look up and know his father had made a bright thing over the way in. Silas Crane did not answer her. He could not. Something in him that had been building one stone at a time against the sea for 48 years simply gave, all at once, without a sound, the way a wall gives. And the hardest man in the valley put his face down into his banker's hands and wept, like the boy who had left the day he was old enough, taken his mother's name, sworn off his father's, and never once known the door had a star over it. What he did after, he did slowly, over that summer, and the story will not gild it. He was not made gentle in a night. Such men never are. But he deeded the great house on the hill, the house his father built, the finest for 80 miles, to the town of Hollow Creek, for a school and a meeting hall, and a place for travelers who came off the pass with nowhere else in the world to be. And over the door, the paint scraped back at last. He left the little carved star standing in the open, where any child going in to learn his letters could look up and see it. And so we come, as such stories must, back around to Christmas Eve. 1 year on, from the night the beggar knocked, the snow coming down again, soft over Hollow Creek. The pass is shut again, the valley folded in again for the winter. But go down the length of Main Street this year, past the great house on the hill that is a school now, with a star over its door, down to the poor end, where the road gives up being a road, down to the little cabin at the creek. There is a light in the window. There has always been a light in that window, one candle, on this night. Only this year it is not one candle. It is a whole row of them, set close along the glass, more than a poor woman ought to burn, so that the light of them lies out gold across the snow a long way, far enough that a man coming down over the Wolf Ridge trail in the dark could not miss it, could not pass it, could not take it for anything but what it is. And the door is not locked. It is a good door. It hangs true. It closes sweet as a book laid shut. But it is not locked, and it will not be. this night or any night, for as long as the woman inside it draws breath. There is a long table in the one room, longer than by rights the room should hold. And there are people down both sides of it, who a year ago would not have met one another's eyes on the street. The Kellermans, the Ainsleys, the livery boy grown taller, Otto down from the Silver Dollar, and at the foot of it come down the hill of his own accord, and not yet easy about it, but come, a spare hard man learning slow how to sit at a table he does not own. There is not much on the table. There does not need to be much. The door is open, and every soul in that room came in out of the cold. Martha Hale sits at the head of it, an old woman now, her hands still going even at the table. And if you looked, you would see she is sewing between the courses a small red bird into the corner of a quilt that will go out in the spring to some stranger she will never meet. West with the wagons, north with the crews, out into the dark of the world, expecting nothing back. For this is what she learned, and what the old man learned, and what the hard man on the hill is learning yet, and what this story has been trying the whole long way to set down plain. That a light in a window costs one candle, and answering it costs your whole supper, and forgiving a debt costs everything you were owed, and that these are the only bargains in this life a soul ever comes away from richer. The passes are shut, the night is cold, but there is a light in the window at the poor end of the valley, and the door is not locked, and the table is long. Nobody sleeps unloved under a sparrow, and in Hollow Creek, from that winter to this one, nobody passes a dark house, for there are no dark houses left to pass.